told you that one of the most celebrated literary geniuses in human history, a man whose work sparked global admiration, spent countless nights consumed by a sense of existential dread? How would you feel if you discovered that Leo Tolstoy, renowned author of War and Peace, and Anna Karenina, found himself unraveling in secret, even as the world applauded his achievements and elevated him to the status of a cultural icon? In the public eye, he was lionized for the depth of his characters and the scope of his narratives. Privately, however, he lay awake wrestling with a question he could not quiet. What is the point of all this? The paradox seems almost cruel. How does one reconcile extraordinary success with a steady, gnawing sense of purposelessness? Imagine creating art that generations admire, garnering financial security, securing personal prestige, and achieving a level of influence few dare to dream of only to close your eyes at night to a persistent interior voice whispering, "So what?" No matter the applause, no matter the accolades, Tolstoy's inner question refused to be silenced. This wasn't just a fleeting mood, a passing wave of sadness brought on by stress or overwork. It was a spiritual crisis that cut to the marrow of his being. He often wrote that the inevitability of death loomed so large in his mind it robbed each day of meaning. So intense was his despair that he hid ropes in his home to remove the temptation of using them in moments of weakness. Here was a man who had claimed the literary summit, who had shaped the cultural imagination of not just Russia, but the broader reading world, and yet he felt his life was teetering on the edge of the most profound emptiness. For Tolstoy, the intensity of his crisis was heightened by an awareness of his gifts. He wasn't just another writer. He was widely hailed as a genius. Yet all that intellectual and creative brilliance couldn't buffer him from the haunting question that shadowed him every evening. Consider your own life for a moment. Have you ever felt that inward tug when the noise of the day fades? When all external validations, be they from work, relationships, or society, seem insufficient? It's that quiet ache, a persistent restlessness that says I'm missing something, but I don't know what. Tolstoy's despair resonates because it echoes the universal human condition. Even if we aren't literary giants, most of us have felt that pang. Is there a purpose to what I'm doing here? Our achievements, no matter how grand or modest, can lose their luster in our innermost recesses, especially when we weigh them against the enormity of time and the inevitability of our mortality. Over time, Tolstoy's crisis intensified. It was not a trivial dark night of the soul or a melodramatic statement of woe. He wrote with unflinching honesty that he feared the silence that awaited him when he put down his pen each day. Fame and recognition brought him no solace. He likened them to shadows dancing at the fringes of a deeper darkness he could not dispel. When he examined the world's definition of success, wealth, esteem, artistry, he found them wanting. They could not fix that internal whisper, nor could they answer the questions that relentlessly circled in his heart. The more he examined these measures of success, the more he realized that they couldn't protect him from the fundamental realities of existence. Each new accolade or financial windfall was a fleeting distraction, a bandage over a deeper wound. And for someone as introspective and precise in his thinking as Tolstoy, the illusions wore thin quickly. The depth of Tolstoy's crisis often shocks those who only see the public side of literary success. After all, people tend to assume that external achievements align with internal fulfillment. But Tolstoy's journals, letters, and autobiographical reflections tell a starkly different story. He was so tormented by the question of life's meaning that he began to view suicide as a logical endpoint if no satisfactory answer appeared. He was both disturbed and fascinated by the notion that one might simply remove oneself from life rather than live in confusion or despair. He reasoned if life has no purpose, if death renders everything meaningless, then continuing to exist might be an absurd gesture. This wasn't just the idle speculation of someone who indulged in philosophical musings while sipping tea in a study lined with books. Tolstoy was a man of action throughout his life. He wore many hats: aristocrat, soldier, educator, writer, philosopher, moralist. He poured his energy into building schools, writing educational primers for peasants, and campaigning for social reforms he deemed vital. And yet in his personal life, he felt a gulf growing wider each day, as if all his activities were perched on the surface of a bottomless chasm. No matter how many projects he took on, no matter how many philanthropic initiatives he launched, the underlying question remained: what is all this for if everything ends in the grave? In that sense, Tolstoy's story is a mirror for us. Even if we haven't reached the same level of anguish, many of us understand the shape of this dilemma. We graduate from one phase of life to another, accomplish goals, maybe start a family, cultivate careers, and chase accomplishments. We're told our markers of success, yet there can come a moment when we sit alone in our living rooms, the hum of everyday life receding, and wonder, why do I do any of this for Tolstoy? This existential knot reached a level of desperation that most people only brush up against in fleeting moments of introspection. A striking part of Tolstoy's darkness was how thoroughly it cut him off from others. Family gatherings that once brought pleasure felt increasingly hollow. Conversations among intellectuals and aristocrats sounded like so many empty echoes bouncing around lofty halls. He saw the people around him continuing with their daily routines, planning the next dinner party, worrying about fashion, discussing the latest cultural trends. And he was horrified. How can they continue living and pretending everything is fine, he wondered. Don't they see how fragile it all is? How none of this answers the real question? This sense of isolation grew because the more he observed others taking life at face value, the more starkly he perceived his own inability to do so. For the first time, he began to truly sense that brilliance, status, and external success were no antidote to existential despair. Indeed, they might even exacerbate it. When people see you as the pinnacle of creativity and wisdom, there's a crushing weight to the realization that you, of all people, still haven't figured out how to silence the whisper of, what does it all mean? It's one thing to be struggling at the bottom, convinced that success will deliver peace. It's quite another to be at the top, realized or recognized, and find the question is still there, unwavering. Yet in his darkest moments, Tolstoy began noticing something among the people who worked his land, those he referred to as the peasants. They weren't educated by high society standards, nor did they spend their evenings debating philosophy in candlelit salons. By aristocratic measures, they had nothing: no prestige, no financial security, minimal formal learning. Yet they seemed to have a calmness. He lacked an unshakable sense of belonging within life's tapestry. While Tolstoy's mind spun itself into knots, they rose early, labored in the fields, shared simple meals with their families, and laughed freely around the hearth. Their days were physically grueling, yet their spirits often displayed a serenity that stunned him. How could it be? Tolstoy wondered that these people seemed more at peace than he was. They had never tasted the riches or enjoyed the comforts that aristocracy brought. They had little hope of upward mobility in a rigid social system. Many of them lived day to day their lives punctuated by harsh winters and precarious harvests. By all accounts, they had every reason to feel anxious or despairing, and yet they carried a quiet assurance that life in its ordinary rhythms was valuable. It baffled him at first. Was this ignorance? Was it superstition? What struck Tolstoy most was their simple faith. He had grown up in a society where formal religion often felt like a set of rigid customs layered with hypocrisy and used for social posturing. He had distanced himself from the institutional church, finding its dogma unconvincing and its adherents often lacking sincerity. But in these peasants, he observed something different, a lived belief that did not require elaborate justifications or grand theological treatises. Their faith wasn't about brandishing moral superiority or winning intellectual debates. It was a quiet, steadfast trust in something larger than their own individual selves, a sense of sacredness that infused their daily existence. In watching them, Tolstoy saw that this faith granted them what no amount of worldly success had ever given him, an underlying confidence in the goodness and purpose of life. They were not anxious about proving themselves. They were not crushed by an incessant need for validation. They possessed little in the way of personal wealth, but they had a richness of spirit that made Tolstoy's inner emptiness feel even more glaring. If existence was a mystery, they did not seem tormented by it. Rather, they received it with a sort of gentle acceptance. This recognition rattled him deeply because it pointed towards something he could not dismiss. Maybe the intellect wasn't the ultimate key to peace. Perhaps an overly analytical approach to life, where every question must be dissected, can lead us in circles. Could the meaning of life be something that is not grasped through the mind alone, but also through the heart? The implication was both comforting and unsettling. On the one hand, it suggested a way beyond the shadows of despair. On the other, it challenged his entire approach. He'd always turned to books, theories, and rational reflection for answers. Now he was confronted with the idea that perhaps he needed a different kind of understanding, one that the peasants quietly lived day in and day out. As Tolstoy observed these rural communities, he noticed acts of unspoken kindness that did not conform to grand moral philosophies, but felt deeply meaningful in their simplicity. A neighbor would help another mend a roof without expecting anything more than a shared meal in return. Families would gather in small wooden chapels, not with pomp and ceremony, but with a humble longing to connect with something beyond their everyday concerns. Children were taught to pray by seeing their parents live their faith rather than hearing them sermonize. The more Tolstoy looked, the more he saw a culture of lived values, practical demonstrations of care, responsibility, and reverence. This stood in stark contrast to the aristocratic world he knew too well. In those circles, a great deal of energy went into maintaining appearances, discussing lofty ideas, and outdoing one another in wit or refinement. It was a constant performance where self-worth hinged on success and social standing. Rarely did anyone pause to ask, in earnest, are we actually living any better? Are we actually kinder or more grounded than these peasants we oversee? In witnessing the peasants' way of life, Tolstoy began to suspect that the barest forms of daily existence, tending the soil, nurturing family bonds and offering a hand to a neighbor contained the seeds of purpose he had been searching for. One could interpret Tolstoy's discovery as a kind of spiritual humility. He had prided himself on his intellect and creative powers, yet these alone could not quell his despair. The peasants, many of whom couldn't even read, appeared far less tormented by questions of life's meaning. Was it possible Tolstoy dared to wonder that intellectual pride had blinded him to a subtle truth? Over time, his interactions with the peasants stopped being mere observations and became a form of apprenticeship. He started letting their day-to-day simplicity instruct him, even challenge him on what living authentically might look like. This was an extraordinary shift for a man of his stature. He had garnered international acclaim. People recognized him as a literary master. Royalty and intellectuals frequented his home. But the most profound lessons he gleaned came not from academic symposia or exclusive salons. They came from the open fields and the wood-floored huts of people who lived simply and died with less fanfare than he would ever know. This humility set the stage for what would become his spiritual transformation, a kind of homecoming to something fundamental that years of privileged living had obscured. At first, it was a slow, reluctant surrender. Part of him resisted, skeptical that the answer to his existential quest could be so straightforward. Yet as months turned into years, he could not deny the inner shift. Their faith seemed to flow from a deeper well than dogmatic religion. Tolstoy recognized that these were individuals who lived as if their lives had inherent meaning without needing to formulate a grand defense. In doing so, they bypassed the paralyzing cynicism and doubt that had cornered him. Was it naive? Was it wisdom? Tolstoy found himself leaning toward the latter conclusion, even though it defied all his refined intellectual instincts. Eventually, a kind of epiphany took root. Some truths aren't comprehended by logic alone. They're lived. Tolstoy realized that much of his existential anguish sprang from his need to understand life, to dissect and categorize it as though it were a problem requiring a precise formula. He had read widely in philosophy, science, and theology, seeking a definitive solution to the question of existence. Each time he thought he was close, he found a new contradiction. Like a traveler stumbling in the dark, he'd reach out for one theoretical lantern after another, only to find it cast incomplete shadows. But the peasants' approach was different. They weren't trying to solve life, they were fully living it. Their solace came from shared rituals, harvest celebrations, communal prayers, neighborly gatherings to celebrate births, to mourn deaths, to mark the passage of time with a communal sense of connectedness. Their faith did not present itself as intellectual certainty. It was simply a way of moving through the world with a soft heart and open hands. When faced with adversity, they banded together. When confronted with blessings, they expressed gratitude without overthinking it. In turning his gaze inward, Tolstoy recognized the arrogance in believing he could reduce the human condition to a neat theory. Life, in its vastness, resists such packaging. The more he accepted that, the more he experienced moments of peace. He felt his breathing ease when he allowed himself to not know the ultimate answers, yet continue living in alignment with principles of compassion, humility, and sincerity. Instead of conquering life's riddles through scholarship or debate, he found that simply doing good, helping the needy, sharing resources, engaging wholeheartedly with family and neighbors, brought a sense of purpose that no philosophical text ever did. This realization came with profound consequences. Tolstoy started to alter his outward lifestyle, letting it reflect these inner changes. He dressed more plainly, eschewed social formalities, and minimized public appearances. It was not an attempt to posture as holy or above worldly concerns. It was a tangible reflection that he no longer needed the external trappings to feel complete. Those who once admired his wit and aristocratic bearing were astonished to see him choose the company of common folk engaging in menial labor and discoursing on the value of simple living. Yet Tolstoy had discovered something that overshadowed the allure of worldly praise, the liberty that arises when you no longer chase applause to validate your being. His transformation was akin to returning to the core of human experience, unsullied by the frills of cultured pretense. It gave him the courage to speak up on issues of social justice, to challenge institutions he once took for granted, and to question hierarchies that placed aristocrats far above peasants. Far from an empty show, these changes were a practical response to his realization that the peasant's quiet faith and unwavering sense of belonging held the key to the meaning he had so desperately sought. By stepping into a life of simplicity, he was in effect bridging the gap between his intense philosophical inquiries and the grounded wisdom he saw in their daily existence. To understand the full scope of Tolstoy's inner turmoil, we have to step back and consider how he tried time and again to find a purely rational explanation for life's mysteries. In his quest, he devoured the works of Western philosophers Descartes, Kant, Schopenhauer, Nietzsche, and many others. Each had a grand construction, a lens through which to view reality, and each offered glimpses of insight, but ultimately fell short when measured against Tolstoy's personal experience of despair. He found that even the most coherent intellectual framework crumbled when confronted with the raw fact of mortality. If everything ends in death, he asked, how can anything truly matter? He likened life to a traveler falling into a well clutching a thin branch, while hungry mice slowly gnawed at it. Above him, a dragon with open jaws. Below him, darkness. This analogy wasn't an exercise in poetic drama. It expressed the dread he felt acutely, the sense that human life dangles precariously, momentarily between the inevitability of birth and death, with no obvious reason for existing in the interim. For all the brilliance and sophistication of Western philosophical systems, none could offer a definitive escape from this metaphorical web. Yet in the midst of this bleak analogy, the peasant's simple faith presented a path that refused to be captured by purely rational terms. Their answer to the traveler's predicament was not an elaborate theory that overcame the dragon or stilled the darkness. Instead, it was a quiet acceptance that some dragons remain dragons, that some questions remain unresolved, and that living with moral clarity and communal love could be enough. That kind of acceptance was both scandalous and enlightening to a mind so rigorously trained to dissect and debate. Over time, Tolstoy began to feel that reason alone, although powerful in science and the practicalities of everyday problem-solving, was insufficient for grappling with life's profound questions. Reason could articulate the predicament, define it in grim detail, but it couldn't resolve the existential ache. Faith, on the other hand, as he now perceived it, wasn't a blind acceptance of dogma or a refusal to engage with the intellect. It was an orientation of the heart that allowed space for mystery. A cynic might say the peasants were simply ignorant, free from the burdens of high-level thinking. But Tolstoy recognized that as a superficial dismissal. What he witnessed was a depth of sincerity, a willingness to integrate belief with daily acts of kindness and responsibility. This was faith in its lived form, offering a rootedness that outlasted the ephemeral nature of achievements and accolades. That faith encompassed a trust in the continuity of life, a sense that every moment carried significance because it was woven into a larger tapestry. Call it God, call it nature, call it the cosmic order. Whatever name it bore, it gave them resilience in the face of hardship and a sense of unity in the face of isolation. Tolstoy's journey away from the glitz of aristocratic society and toward the humble steadiness of peasant life was not a step into naivety, but a deliberate choice to live more authentically. He realized painfully, yet liberatingly, that so much of his intellectual despair stemmed from trying to control life by understanding it completely. In the shadow of death, all achievements can appear absurd if one sees them merely as items checked off a cosmic list. But if one begins to see life itself as a gift not needing ultimate proof or theoretical justification, then a subtle but transformative shift occurs. After this shift in consciousness took hold, Tolstoy began to reject many of the privileges and external markers of success he'd once eagerly sought. He wore simple clothing modeled after the peasants and immersed himself in manual work. Critics called him an eccentric or a fanatic. Some believed this was a phase or quirk of an aging writer undergoing a midlife crisis. But in truth, Tolstoy had uncovered an internal compass that pointed toward sincerity over status, humility over pride, and compassion over competition. He chose to follow it, come what may. Despite his newfound convictions, he didn't entirely renounce the world. Instead, he engaged with it on new terms. He wrote essays and articles, some of which were censored by the Russian state for their radical ideas, particularly his arguments about non-violent resistance and the moral responsibility of individuals to refuse participation in systems of oppression. Far from withdrawing into isolation, he amplified a call to authenticity across social structures, challenging the aristocracy, the government, and even the formal church for perpetuating what he saw as hollow rituals and power plays. In these later writings, you can sense the depth of his spiritual transition. He believed that real faith, the kind that carried the peasants through their hardships, was anchored in love, a love that transcended the boundaries of class, nationality, and creed. For Tolstoy, love was neither a romantic trope nor an empty sentiment. It was an active force, a moral imperative that, when lived sincerely, had the power to reorder society itself. He didn't paint this as a utopian dream. He knew well the capacity for human cruelty. Rather, he saw that each individual's choice to live by love through small acts of care and larger stands against injustice formed the bedrock of a meaningful life. For modern audiences, Tolstoy's transformation serves as a reminder that we often search for meaning in the wrong places. Our culture is still enamored with outward success, whether measured by wealth, fame, or social media influence. Yet as Tolstoy's life demonstrates, even the highest pinnacles of achievement can leave a soul unsatisfied if there's no deeper foundation. The lesson is neither to demonize achievement nor to idolize poverty, but to look inward and ask whether we are aligning our lives with the truths that genuinely nourish us. No award, no job title, No amount of recognition can substitute for a grounded sense of purpose that we choose daily. If part one of this story introduces Tolstoy's existential crisis and discovery among the peasantry, part two delves into how his search for meaning collided with and ultimately reshaped his views on philosophy, science, and institutional religion. Before he fully embraced the lessons gleaned from observing simpler folk, Tolstoy rigorously tested other paths. He was by nature a consummate researcher, an intellectual who wouldn't settle for anything that felt like an incomplete explanation. When he first turned to science, he was impressed by the discoveries of his era. Darwinian evolution, the blossoming fields of biology, physics, and the mathematics that underpinned them offered a framework for understanding life's processes. But science, for all its elegance, couldn't assuage his most pressing concern. Why do these processes exist at all, and what ultimate purpose, if any, do they serve? Science could describe the how, but it fell silent when Tolstoy demanded a why that would quell his spiritual hunger. He then turned to philosophy, hoping to find that rigorous human reason might lead him to a universal truth. He studied ancient Greek thinkers, devoured Eastern philosophies, and moved on to modern Western existentialists. Each system brought fascinating perspectives and partial resolutions, but none quieted the persistent question in his own soul. Indeed, the more he read, the more he saw that philosophers themselves disagreed and that each set of answers was contingent on premises that could be upended by further critique. When he returned to the Russian Orthodox Church, hoping to find the existential anchor he desired, he encountered dogma that felt stale and hierarchical structures that seemed more interested in preserving tradition than genuinely nurturing faith. From his vantage point, the official church was tangled with state power, entangled in a web of politics and rituals that left little room for the raw sincerity he had witnessed in the peasants' communal gatherings. The same question arose: if religion turned into a series of ceremonies and pronouncements, how different was it really from a philosophical system? Where was the living core, the dynamic force that could address the heart's deepest longings? What Tolstoy found was that every organized system, be it philosophical or religious, risked calcifying into a set of rules and beliefs that followers adopted uncritically. Over time, these structures started to function like closed systems, resistant to questioning and robust self-examination. The peasant's faith, by contrast, had a fluid quality. It wasn't about ticking theological boxes or performing outward rituals for social acceptance. It existed more like an undercurrent, something you felt rather than primarily reasoned about. In this period, Tolstoy wrote extensively about his internal contradictions. He admitted there was a part of him that wanted a neat, definable answer, some cosmic equation that would put his restless mind at ease. However, another part understood that life's mystery might be irreducible, that even the best human concepts can't fully capture the experience of living in a body loving another person or gazing at a star-filled sky. If life was a dance, then perhaps his era was trying to pin every step to a formula instead of allowing himself to be led by the music. Paradoxically, the more Tolstoy recognized the limits of intellectual systems, the more he became open to the notion of a lived faith, something not pinned down by logic, but demonstrated in how we treat one another, how we handle adversity, and how we celebrate what's beautiful. This shift did not happen overnight. It involved a drawn-out wrestling match between his analytical mind and his longing for solace. He didn't want to become anti-intellectual. He simply realized that the most important truths might reside beyond the boundaries of pure reason. He came to a turning point where he understood that if he continued to insist on a purely rational solution to the meaning of life, he might well end in despair. Reason alone, unaccompanied by love or humility, is a blunt instrument. It can dissect a flower into its biological parts, but it cannot convey the wonder of seeing it bloom in spring. This observation propelled him to read scripture, both Christian and texts from other spiritual traditions, in a new light. No longer was he looking to these writings as a set of absolute dogmas. Instead, he read them for insights into how people have lived with mystery throughout the ages. He found echoes of his own questions in the Psalms, parables, and spiritual poems of diverse cultures. Over and over, these texts pointed not toward the elimination of mystery, but toward a way of inhabiting it. They suggested that you don't conquer the question of life's meaning by solving it. Rather, you engage it, live through it, and let it transform you. This resonated deeply with what he'd seen in the peasants. They did not talk about the meaning of life. They simply lived in a way that made meaning real. Yet adopting such a posture challenged everything he had once held dear. If intelligence and artistic brilliance were not sufficient for personal peace, then what role should they play? Could he still value his intellect while also recognizing its limitations? This was no small issue for a man whose entire identity was bound up in writing, teaching, and engaging in public discourse. The transformation required him to strike a new balance, to use his intellect as a tool rather than a tyrant, to let it serve the deeper pursuits of compassion and sincerity. The choice was clear, but not easy. Either he would continue on the road of ceaseless questioning, risking a deeper plunge into hopelessness, or he would allow his heart's intuitive sense of goodness to have at least equal footing with his intellect. In the end, he chose to integrate both, with the peasants' example and their quiet faith acting as a catalyst for this integration. By letting go of the relentless need to dominate the mystery through analysis, he made room for awe, gratitude, and genuine presence in everyday life. This new understanding rippled through Tolstoy's personal and public life. He grew more attuned to social inequalities, which once seemed a matter of course in aristocratic circles. In earlier years, he might have passed beggars in the street without substantial thought, but now he saw them through fresh eyes. He recognized they were not part of some cosmic joke or an inevitable social hierarchy. They were fellow human beings worthy of dignity. That shift in perspective, rooted in a faith that all people share. A sacred commonality prompted him to act more boldly. He challenged the state and its ways of perpetuating class distinctions. He spoke out against serfdom and oppressive labor practices with a fervor that made the ruling authorities uneasy. From Tolstoy's viewpoint, if life truly held a divine spark, then forcing others to toil in misery was not just socially unfair, it was a moral crime. Faith, in this sense, was no passive acceptance of the status quo. It was an active call to reshape society in the image of compassion. Parallel to his political writings, Tolstoy also experienced a shift in how he interacted with his own family. He spent more time engaged in the daily routines of his household activities he once viewed as trivial. He found meaning in helping his children learn and in cultivating a genuine though these domestic arenas were rife with their own tensions, especially as his changing views created friction in a household accustomed to luxury, he persisted in embodying his new convictions. The grand philosophical debates in his head began to take a back seat to the tangible acts of love and service he could perform each day. This was not simply a moralistic stance for appearances. He was trying to live in such a way that he no longer relied on external validation or the next intellectual victory. The former Tolstoy thrived on the applause of literary salons, the sense of being recognized as a profound thinker and writer. The transformed Tolstoy found that he could forego those accolades without regret, if it meant aligning himself more closely with the simplicity and sincerity he'd come to see as crucial. At the same time, he started receiving letters from readers around the world, many of whom testified that his works resonated precisely because they explored the difficult terrain of despair and meaning. He responded by reminding them that true solace was not found in any single text his included, but in the quiet, daily commitment to act from love. That love, he explained, was best understood not as an emotion, but as a choice. You choose to see others as part of the same fragile, beautiful web of life. You choose to care for them not out of pity, but out of recognition of a shared humanity. He found himself writing about religion, morality, and ethics as inseparable from one's treatment of fellow beings, a stance that grew out of the revelation that meaning is not only an intellectual concept, but also an embodied reality. It's important to note that Tolstoy's spiritual insights weren't divorced from his experiences as a writer of epic novels. He had spent years crafting characters of incredible depth, characters who grappled with war, peace, love, betrayal, family bonds, and existential dread. His literary creations often engaged with the very questions that tormented him personally. When he found a new path out of despair, his imagination and expressive talents also found fresh ground. He began to see that stories weren't merely vehicles for entertainment or moral lessons. They were laboratories of human experience. In his fiction, he could test the extremes of human emotion and action, revealing the universal seeds of joy, sorrow, and redemption that link us all. In many ways, the shift in his worldview encouraged him to take a more critical look at the institutions around him. He wrote piercing critiques of the Church's alliance with the state, dissecting how official doctrines could easily become instruments of power rather than vessels of genuine faith. He challenged the idea of blind patriotism, arguing that a true Christian ethos, or any sincere spiritual ethos, would never condone violence or aggression towards one's neighbors. Some of these writings drew intense backlash. Church authorities even excommunicated him. But for Tolstoy, such condemnation only underscored how far the Church had strayed from its founding principles of love and humility. His words found kindred spirits in unexpected places. Far beyond Russia, individuals like Mohandas K. Gandhi in India and later Martin Luther King Jr. in the United States took inspiration from Tolstoy's calls for nonviolent resistance. Though Tolstoy's final decades were fraught with conflicts both internal and external, his moral vision resonated deeply with reformers and revolutionaries who were similarly seeking a path guided by conscience and underpinned by faith. Yet Tolstoy never claimed to be a saint. He was open about his failings and contradictions. His diaries reveal struggles with pride, anger, and the complexities of family relationships. The transformation he went through didn't render him immune to human frailties. Rather, it heightened his awareness of them. rest on spiritual laurels. The journey, as he saw it, was about constant return to the core values of compassion, honesty, and a faith in life's sacredness. As his public persona became more radical in its simplicity, the aristocratic circles that once embraced him withered away. Many found his ascetic choices threatening to their lifestyle. Others ridiculed him as another eccentric noble dabbling in peasant life. But Tolstoy no longer needed their approval. The deeper he waded into this new perspective, the less he was haunted by the question of life's meaning. He still acknowledged the mystery. He still recognized that death awaited everyone. But now he found enough purpose in living decently, loving well, and giving voice to those who suffered. The implications for modern life are striking. We often operate under the assumption that if we can just accomplish more or earn more or know more, the existential ache will subside. We churn through achievements, collecting degrees, promotions online, followers, whatever our culture has deemed the currency of success. Yet if Tolstoy's journey has any message for us, it's that this approach can leave our innermost selves profoundly unsatisfied. The deeper call, as life suggests, is not upward or outward, but inward. This doesn't mean we should shun all ambition or worldly pursuits. Tolstoy was not advocating for everyone to abandon their jobs, families, or personal aspirations. Rather, he was pointing out that fulfillment lies in the orientation of our hearts. Are we aligned with a pursuit of genuine connection, compassion, and sincerity? Or are we chasing achievements because we've been taught to believe that's what makes us valuable? Tolstoy's crisis began when he realized that despite having achieved everything external society prizes, his heart still longed for an anchor. The peasants, in contrast, exhibited a steady calm that seemed to arise from within. Their orientation was less about self and more about a shared bond with life itself. This internal shift can be frightening because it often demands releasing old identities. For Tolstoy, it meant letting go of being the great writer in the eyes of his peers. For us, it might mean questioning whether our job titles, social status, or material comforts truly define us. Many fear that if they relinquish these external markers, they'll lose their sense of purpose altogether. Tolstoy's transformation suggests that the exact opposite can happen by disengaging from the relentless need to prove yourself. You open space to be yourself. Yet such a path isn't necessarily tranquil. Conflict arose in Tolstoy's personal relationships as his values changed. He clashed with his wife Sophia over finances and property rights. He butted heads with government officials and church leaders. True transformation often provokes friction because it challenges existing structures, both internal psychological structures and external social norms. Nevertheless, Tolstoy believed that genuine inner peace was worth these struggles. We should also note that Tolstoy's path was not about romanticizing poverty or glorifying a lack of learning. He never suggested that reading and thinking were bad or that peasants lived an unambiguously perfect life. Instead, he called for a unity of intellect and spirit, a learning that is wedded to compassion and open to humility. When reason is driven solely by the ego's quest for dominance, it fails to deliver peace. But when reason is guided by a heart that recognizes our shared vulnerability, it becomes a tool for building bridges rather than fortresses. What emerges from Tolstoy's story is an invitation to each of us to look more closely at our own lives. Where are we seeking validation? And why, what do we believe, will finally give us rest from that persistent question, why am I here? And could it be that the simple acts of daily goodness, the small gestures of care, hold more transformative power than any grandiose achievement ever could? By now, it becomes clear that Tolstoy's turning point, his observation of peasant life and subsequent embrace of simplicity, was more than just a shift in outward behavior. It was a philosophical and spiritual overhaul. The key to understanding this is recognizing the radical nature of letting go. Before this shift, Tolstoy had lived in a constant forward motion of ambition, writing his masterpieces, engaging in intellectual debates, building a reputation as a moral philosopher. All of these pursuits, while significant, were underpinned by a desire for resolution of the existential riddle. But letting go means releasing the demand that life's meaning be spelled out in black and white. It means standing before the mystery with open hands instead of clenched fists. In adopting this posture, Tolstoy found he could finally breathe. He could appreciate the simplest of blessings, morning light streaming through a window, children's laughter, the earthy smell of tilled soil without immediately questioning their ultimate value. The wonder that had been stifled by over-analysis started to flourish once again. Of course, such letting go doesn't imply passivity or nihilism. Tolstoy grew more, not less active in addressing social issues precisely because he saw that every interaction had moral and spiritual weight. His new faith-based perspective demanded that he treat others as reflections of a shared human essence. The peasants he once overlooked or regarded from a distance became guides, or at least fellow travelers on the path of living in alignment with deeper truths. And in recognizing that even his intellectual gifts were just one thread in a larger tapestry, he gained the humility that allowed him to see more, feel more, and ultimately give more. In this second part of Tolstoy's story, we also see the seeds of what would become his legacy. Though he parted ways with the institutional church, his writings on religious and moral subjects inspired a wave of thinkers and activists across continents. He argued that if we truly believe in the primacy of love, then no border or social ranking should take precedence over it. Such statements had real repercussions in a world teetering on the brink of massive social and political upheaval. They also sowed the idea that each individual has the power, indeed the responsibility, to shape society through personal acts of conscience, rather than waiting for top-down reforms. All the while, Tolstoy's struggle with personal demons included bouts of doubt and interpersonal conflict. This was not a neat, tidy narrative of conversion followed by unbroken serenity. Rather, it was a life story that remained deeply human, complicated, imperfect, and occasionally tumultuous. And perhaps that's the most compelling part of it. It suggests that meaning is not found in the absence of struggle, but grows alongside it. Life doesn't become easy when you decide to live with integrity. It often becomes more challenging. Yet the kind of challenge that arises is rich with purpose, deeply woven with the possibility of genuine transformation. Thus, Tolstoy's significance today isn't limited to the realm of literary accomplishment. His life stands as a testament to the idea that even towering intellect and worldly triumphs can leave a soul bankrupt if the heart is denied a guiding role. At the same time, it reaffirms that every moment, no matter how ordinary, can become a prayerful act of presence when approached with an open heart and an open mind. As we move toward the final arc of Tolstoy's saga, let's pause to reflect on why his story continues to captivate us. At first glance, the life of a 19th century Russian noble might seem distant from our high-tech, globally connected world. Yet the feelings he grappled with, anxiety about death, dissatisfaction with hollow pursuits, yearning for a sense of belonging in a world that often feels cold, are as present today as ever. The digital era has given us more avenues for distraction, but also more opportunities to notice how unsatisfied we can remain in the midst of abundance. Tolstoy's pivot to a simpler, more faith-infused way of living was not a rejection of progress or a condemnation of human intellect. Rather, it was a recalibration. He began to see that knowledge and progress must serve a higher moral purpose if they're to have lasting value. If they do not, if they simply exist as markers of how advanced or superior we are, they risk becoming empty trophies. The peasants who influenced him might not have known the latest scientific discoveries, but they seem to have an innate wisdom about living in harmony with each other, with the land, and with the invisible threads connecting all existence. In telling his story, we recognize that Tolstoy bridged worlds. He was an aristocrat who found deeper kinship with peasants. He was a thinker who saw the limitations of thought itself. He was a Christian who challenged the established church. He was a pacifist with a military background. He was a literary giant who ended up questioning the value of literature unless it served to uplift the human spirit. All these contradictions made him a magnet for both adoration and scorn. Nonetheless, he stayed the course, guided increasingly by that quiet, moral compass he had rediscovered. Perhaps the most striking aspect is the emotional honesty he brought to his inquiries. Many of us have pockets of existential dread we suppress, unwilling to admit them publicly or even face them privately. Tolstoy, on the other hand, confronted his terror of meaninglessness head-on. Rather than burying his despair in diversions or doubling down on a cycle of endless achievement, he treated despair itself as a teacher, a doorway to deeper truth. For him, hitting rock bottom exposed the futility of everything he had previously prized. Only in that emptiness could a new perspective germinate. The notion that despair might be a crucial step in the quest for meaning resonates through spiritual and philosophical traditions worldwide. Whether in the Buddhist recognition of dukkha suffering as the impetus for seeking enlightenment, or the Christian concept of the dark night of the soul, it seems that real transformation is often preceded by a period of disillusionment. Tolstoy's disillusionment was profound, threatening his life itself. Yet the survival of his spirit, the way he rose from that chasm and walked a new path, stands as a testament to the human capacity for renewal. In acknowledging his own brokenness, he found a path toward wholeness, one that didn't depend on perfect coherence or social validation. It was a path that recognized the inherent dignity of all that strove to lessen suffering, and that ultimately rested in a faith that transcended logic while never outright denying it. In this final section, we look at how Tolstoy's insights offer a vision not just for his era, but for any age that grapples with questions of purpose, spiritual hunger, and moral responsibility. By the time he reached his later years, he was articulating a kind of blueprint for what we might call sacred living. It was a way of being that recognized life's profound mystery while emphasizing the importance of love and service in everyday existence. And the crux was, this one does not need to find meaning as much as one needs to choose it. For many of us, the quest for meaning seems like a treasure hunt, something out there to be discovered if only we had the correct map. But Tolstoy flipped this perspective. From his vantage point, meaning arises the moment we engage deeply with life as it is rather than how we wish it might be. That engagement is an act of faith, not in the sense of adhering to rigid doctrines, but faith in the innate value of existence, a trust that by living kindly, compassionately, and truthfully, we participate in something sacred. Yet the word sacred can be polarizing in modern contexts, often associated with religious institutions that may feel out of touch. Tolstoy's understanding of the sacred was far from institutional mandates. It was what he saw in the peasants' day-to-day routines, the careful tending of fields that would feed families, the quiet prayers whispered without fanfare, the unwavering support offered to a neighbor in need. These simple acts were sacred because they aligned people with a sense of life's worth beyond mere survival or self-interest. Tolstoy thus extended the concept of worship beyond Sunday services and cathedrals to the realm of everyday gestures. Taking time to truly listen to someone's sorrows could be an act of worship. Choosing ethical practices in business or farming became a sacred duty. Forgiving a friend who wronged you or admitting your own fault when you hurt someone else. These were the holy acts that, in his view, shaped the soul far more than chanting liturgies by rote. In championing this perspective, Tolstoy opened himself to criticism from multiple fronts. Traditional clergy viewed him as undermining church authority. Intellectuals accused him of a naive romanticism, turning a blind eye to the complexities of modern society. His aristocratic peers saw him as an alarming rebel who threatened the social order by suggesting that one's moral worth had nothing to do with rank or pedigree. Nonetheless, he carried on, bolstered by a conviction that what he had seen and felt was real. And so a key lesson from Tolstoy's later years is the power of living as if life truly matters. So often, we wait for some grand epiphany or external validation to reassure us that we're on the right track. But Tolstoy discovered a simpler path. Live now, as though each moment counts, as though each person you meet is worthy of respect, and as though your smallest kindness might echo in ways you cannot foresee. In doing so, he found relief from the torment of not knowing. If death and mystery remained, so did the solace of having chosen a life that felt authentic and purposeful within that mystery. This ethos of acting in alignment with an inner sense of the good has echoes in spiritual philosophies across time and culture. Yet Tolstoy's specific voice had a unique resonance, partly because he embodied the tension between intellect and faith so starkly. Many religious thinkers come from a place of long-standing devotion, while many philosophical skeptics question all forms of faith. Tolstoy, however, straddled both worlds. He was by turns a devout questioner and an ardent believer. He refused to let his intellect lie dormant, yet he also refused to let it rule him tyrannically. In his later letters and diaries, we see a man who is comfortable admitting that not all questions have answers. This was a radical departure from his younger self, who bristled at any notion of unresolvable mystery. Ironically, by allowing these gaps in knowledge, he found the freedom to embrace a more expansive sense of possibility. He didn't need to conclusively define God or the afterlife. It was enough to act with love in the here and now, trusting that the good he did was part of a broader cosmic harmony. He coined the phrase, the moral law, within echoing Kant's famous concept of the moral law, but investing it with a spiritual dimension that recognized our interconnectedness. Tolstoy argued that this moral law is not something superimposed by religious institutions or social contracts. Rather, it's an innate guiding principle that reveals itself when we strip away ego pretense and the relentless thirst for external validation. You sense it when you realize that harming another being brings discomfort that goes beyond mere social taboo. It strikes at a deeper truth. You sense it when an act of kindness leaves you feeling whole, as though you've just acted in alignment with something both within and beyond yourself. These insights found an even broader audience as political and social activists latched onto Tolstoy's writings on nonviolence. The seeds that he planted, particularly regarding the moral imperative to refrain from violence, influenced individuals who were seeking a more humane way to enact change. When Gandhi wrote to Tolstoy, he referred to him as a mentor, even though they never met in person. Their correspondence illuminated how timeless Tolstoy's ethical stance could be, transcending borders and religious affiliations. Yet for all the global impact of his ideas, Tolstoy's counsel ultimately points inward. He continually reminded people that social transformation begins with personal transformation. A revolution that does not spring from a revolution in the human heart is doomed to recreate the same injustices under a new banner. Tolstoy's shift away from aristocratic norms was more than a symbolic gesture. It was a tangible expression of how he believed societal structures must yield to moral laws that respect the dignity of every individual. We see in him a man who laid down the laurels of intellectual supremacy for the far more challenging task of heart-centered living. He recognized that every step in that direction would be fraught with misunderstandings, not least from those closest to him. Still, he was convinced it was worth the cost. After all, what good was the world's approval if he couldn't face himself with honesty at the end of each day? A central paradox of Tolstoy's later life was that as he let go of the very things most people chase, wealth, status, intellectual dominance, he grew increasingly influential on a global scale. People from various walks of life, whether devoutly religious or staunchly secular, found in his writings a profound resonance. The rawness of his personal testimony, admitting how close he came to ending his own life, revealing the desperation he felt, broke through layers of social politeness and reached the common human thread of existential concern. This paradox highlights something crucial about influence itself. When someone speaks or writes from a place of genuine conviction, one forged in crisis and tested by real-life choices, that voice carries weight. People sense authenticity. Tolstoy's words about renouncing violence, about living a life guided by moral law, and about embracing a love that transcends self-interest were not mere theories. He enacted them often at great personal cost. This gave his words a gravitas that airy speculation or detached philosophy could never attain. In describing the impact of his transformation, it's also important to address what he didn't become. He wasn't a hermit locked away in a cave, eschewing all contact with society. He maintained relationships and continued writing, though his subjects now had a more direct moral thrust. Nor did he devolve into fanaticism, screaming doomsday predictions on street corners. His shift was quieter. Deeper, he chose to live differently, to see differently, and to write with a new intention to awaken others to the possibility of meaning within the uncertainty of life. Indeed, one might argue that Tolstoy's greatest gift was not the bulk of his novels or essays, but the example of his ongoing willingness to evolve. He never claimed finality. He continually questioned his motives, recognized his hypocrisy, and tried to inch closer to the kind of integrity he admired in those peasants who first nudged him out of despair. This perpetual seeking kept him humble, a refreshing contrast to the intellectual elites who often concluded they had arrived at the truth. What if we took this paradox to heart in our own lives? What if instead of chasing illusions of final security, be it in wealth, reputation, or even our intellectual positions, we placed our faith in the honest journey of becoming? This would mean allowing ourselves to step into uncertainty without seeking to quell it through constant busyness or endless rationalization. It would mean making kindness a cornerstone, not because it's always easy, but because it aligns with a deeper call to cherish life. It would mean recognizing that we cannot save ourselves from mortality, but we can choose how we spend our days, how we fill our moments, and how we treat the strangers and loved ones who cross our path. Tolstoy's later life also reminds us that such a path doesn't come with guaranteed external reward. In fact, it often invites misunderstanding and conflict, but the reward of inner coherence, of living in a way that doesn't fracture the soul, can be priceless. It is that coherence, that sense of not betraying oneself, which leads to a softer heart and a quieter mind. As Tolstoy aged, the tensions between his family obligations and his ethical convictions reached a boiling point. He famously left his estate in the dead of night, an act often interpreted as a final stand for the principles he'd been advocating. Though the details remain subject to historical debate, some citing family disputes over money and inheritance, others pointing to creative differences or a simple need for solitude, this dramatic departure symbolized the lengths to which he was willing to go to live authentically. The final chapter of his life, spent largely in exile from the aristocratic circles he once commanded, underscores an often overlooked aspect of personal transformation. It can be lonely. When you renounce certain norms, the community that once sustained you may see you as a traitor. Friends vanish, institutions denounce you, and family members might be left confused or bitter. Tolstoy knew these costs intimately, and yet in his diaries he wrote of an inner freedom he had never before felt. The questions that once tormented him had not vanished. They simply ceased to tyrannize him. By embracing a life of minimalism, humility, and service, he experienced an alignment between his beliefs and his actions. This alignment did not cure him of human frailty. He still battled illnesses, regrets, and bouts of spiritual unease. But the difference was that he no longer viewed these difficulties as proof of life's meaninglessness. Instead, he saw them as part of the ongoing human journey that no one escapes. If anything, suffering became less of an existential threat and more of a shared experience that binds people together. He found solidarity with all who suffered, believing that empathy was far more productive than a self-absorbed quest for perfect personal happiness. In the broader scope of history, Tolstoy's story intersects with the stories of countless others who, upon reaching the heights of success, discovered a haunting emptiness inside. Many celebrities and high achievers in our era speak of a similar phenomenon. You work tirelessly to scale the summit, only to realize the apex is not the utopia you imagined. Tolstoy's difference lay in his refusal to settle for that emptiness. he didn't just mask it with new goals or substances or distractions. He let it break him open, which allowed new understanding to pour in. For those navigating their own existential crossroads, Tolstoy's example can serve as an invitation. It says, "Acknowledge your darkness and don't fear it. Look beyond the accomplishments, the titles, and the applause. If you dare to see emptiness, you also open yourself to a deeper fullness that can arise from humility and love." This path is neither strictly religious nor purely secular. It's an interior stance that transcends those categories. It calls for sincerity, above all else, sincerity in how we view ourselves, treat others, and respond to the quiet urgings of our own conscience. In short, Tolstoy's final act of departure from his estate encapsulated the essence of his spiritual project. He chose not to remain confined within structures material, relational, or intellectual that no longer mirrored his convictions. Although history tells us his end came soon afterward, the way he left the world embodied the searching spirit he had nurtured for decades. He died on a train station platform, not surrounded by aristocratic pomp, but as a traveler on a journey echoing the metaphor of life as a passage through a mysterious land. Tolstoy's influence on later generations underscores the power of lived philosophy. Figures like Gandhi and Martin Luther King Jr. cited him not just for his literary prowess, but for his unyielding stance on nonviolent resistance and the moral imperative to love even those who seem unlovable. That seed of radical compassion did not germinate in a vacuum. It grew out of Tolstoy's own anguish, his disillusionment with conventional solutions, and his ultimate discovery that faith, when freed from institutional rigidity, could be a transformative force. Yet we must avoid painting a picture of Tolstoy as a faultless moral saint. He wrestled with complexities, and his ethical writings could sometimes veer into dogmatic territory. Critics have noted contradictions between his ideals and personal relationships, especially with his wife and children. These tensions highlight a crucial lesson: spiritual or philosophical awakenings do not eradicate personality conflicts or psychological challenges. They simply offer a framework for grappling with them more honestly. What remains inspiring is the unwavering commitment he brought to living in alignment with what he believed was right, even if that meant constant reevaluation of his own actions. In a sense, Tolstoy's story is a guide for how to live in the process of seeking truth rather than clinging to any single formula. That process demands vulnerability, admitting you don't have all the answers, acknowledging that your current understanding might be incomplete, yet pressing on toward greater clarity and love. Modern discourse often fixates on results, on winning, finalizing, concluding. We want the quick route to a sense of fulfillment or a definitive argument that will squash all opponents. Tolstoy in his later years exemplified the opposite approach. He accepted that he was a work in progress until his very last breath. Rather than shutting down debate, he invited it, provided it stemmed from genuine inquiry rather than ego. He remained open to learning, even as he became a teacher for so many. From a religious standpoint, he challenged believers to examine whether their faith was truly about love or just lip service. From a secular viewpoint, he showed that the quest for meaning needn't be answered solely by material success or logical constructs. And from a human standpoint, he exemplified the power of empathy, shifting from seeing peasants as a social class below him to seeing them as moral equals, even teachers. This transformation was radical in a 19th century Russia, defined by strict social hierarchies, and it still resonates today in societies that grapple with class divisions, systemic inequalities, and the illusions of meritocracy. As we near the conclusion of his story, it's worth remembering that Tolstoy did not become a recluse who withdrew from the world in disgust. Quite the opposite, he engaged with humanity, more deeply attempting to lighten its burdens through writing social critique and personal example. Even in disagreement with institutions, he believed fiercely in the potential of individuals to live morally upright lives. His hope lay in the possibility that a single person's commitment to truth could ripple outwards, inspiring transformations in places and people he would never meet. We conclude with a final reflection on Tolstoy's overarching legacy and what it might mean for you reading these words centuries later. At the core of Tolstoy's message is an invitation to intimacy with oneself, with one's community, and with the mystery of life that he came to regard as sacred. He discovered quite painfully that no external achievement could satiate the soul if it was starved of authenticity. The applause of the world is hollow when it doesn't echo within your own heart. Thus, he challenges us to reconsider our definitions of success. Are we merely ticking boxes, securing prestigious positions, accumulating wealth, or courting public admiration? Or are we cultivating a life that resonates with our deepest values, that brings us closer to love and honesty? This doesn't require that we all renounce our possessions and retire to cabins in the woods. It might instead mean slowing down to ask, does my work, my daily routine, my way of relating to others genuinely reflect who I am and what I believe in? His emphasis on service and compassion underscores that a meaningful life is rarely found in isolation. We discover purpose in our bonds with others, in our capacity to ease suffering, and in the simple acts of kindness that so often go unseen. By shifting the center of gravity from self to community, from ego to empathy, we may find the restlessness in our hearts softening. If we treat every interaction, no matter how minor, as an opportunity to practice sincerity, we transform the mundane into the sacred. In confronting the specter of death, Tolstoy recognized that life's meaning lies not in how we can evade our mortality, but in how we choose to spend our finite time. Each day offers the choice between living on autopilot, driven by habit and cultural scripts, or waking up to the present moment with gratitude and wonder. That wonder, when nurtured, blossoms into a sense of reverence for the world in all its messiness and beauty. Finally, Tolstoy's life underscores the profound courage it takes to remain open, to keep asking questions, and to admit when one has been mistaken. If there's a single thread that runs through his entire story, it's the willingness to upend his life again and again in service of a closer alignment with truth as he understood it. That unflagging spirit of inquiry, tempered by compassion, remains as relevant now as it was in his time. So let this be an invitation to you, to all of us, to pause in our busy lives and ask if we've mistaken the world's noise for life's meaning. Have we confused accolades with purpose, or intellect with wisdom? Perhaps like Tolstoy, we need to look at those who live quietly in tune with a deeper rhythm to remember what we have forgotten. Perhaps it's time to let go of our endless striving and instead learn how to be, how to love, and how to let faith, whatever that looks like for each of us, become the gentle compass guiding our steps. With that, we reach the close of this three-part reflection on Leo Tolstoy's journey from celebrated author to spiritual seeker and moral philosopher. His story remains a testament to the fact that beneath the layers of social expectation and intellectual bravado, each of us harbors the same pressing questions. And if Tolstoy's life is any indicator, the answers might just emerge in the humblest of places, in the small acts of kindness, in the silent moments of gratitude, and in the faith that chooses to see life not as a problem to be solved, but a sacred story to be lived. Reflecting on Tolstoy's remarkable journey, it becomes clear true fulfillment isn't about how much we achieve, but how authentically we live. Tolstoy's courageous decision to embrace simplicity and sincerity reminds us that life's deepest answers are often found in everyday acts of kindness, love, and genuine human connection. Perhaps like Tolstoy, we're all invited to slow down, tune in, and listen to the quiet truths our hearts have been whispering all along. What part of Tolstoy's story resonated most with you? We'd love to hear your thoughts, personal experiences, and reflections. So please leave a comment below. Let's keep this meaningful conversation going, because together we can inspire one another to live with purpose, compassion, and courage every day.